Late one evening in October 1994 in Killeen, Texas, Christina felt a sudden need to check on her 6-month-old son. She got out of bed and crossed her bedroom to his crib, which stood beside the window. It was empty. In the same moment, she registered that she had no recollection of going to bed that night. Before she could act on either realization, she heard her son crying, and a bright light appeared outside the house, strong enough to pass through the closed window blinds. She turned to her husband and tried to wake him. However, he did not react and remained asleep throughout everything that followed. She reached for the bedroom light switch, but the power did not respond and the room stayed dark. A second flash of light filled the room, followed again by the sound of her son crying. When her eyes adjusted, the baby was back in his crib in front of her. Her account entered the public record more than a decade later, submitted to an online reporting platform in around 2007, and subsequently documented by researcher Marcus Loth. The report carries the name Christina C., though whether this is the witness's own name has never been confirmed. Christina lifted her son from the crib and checked him over. Satisfied that he was unharmed, she reached across to the window and pulled the blind open. Directly above the house was a triangular craft. She described it as very low and larger than the house itself, close enough that she believed she could have touched it from the roof. It made no sound at all. Scanning the street from the window, she saw that every other house was in darkness. Unless a neighbour happened to be awake and looking out, she was the only witness. She let the blind fall back into place and moved away from the window, and a moment later the light outside went out. She remained standing in the middle of the bedroom holding her son. After an amount of time she could not estimate, she returned to the window. The object was gone. Rather than put the baby back in his crib, she took him into the bed and laid him between herself and her husband. She fell asleep quickly. The following morning, she woke to find her son awake beside her and could not remember why he was there. She had no recall of the previous night at all. It took several hours for the memory to return. When it did, she went immediately to check her son for wounds or markings and found nothing unusual. Checking herself, she found a mark on her leg. When she pressed a finger against it, she could feel something hard beneath the skin, which she compared to a pea or a small pellet. She told her mother what she had found, but told no one else and did not report the incident to any investigator or organisation for over 10 years. By the time she filed the report in around 2007, the mark on her leg was still clearly visible. The object beneath it, she said, had either gone or had settled into the muscle. She also stated, without elaborating further, that this was only one of a number of strange experiences she had had. One further detail appears almost in passing in her report. From the age of 9, she had lived in close proximity to what she described as the largest military base in the United States. Colleen sits directly adjacent to Fort Hood. Several interpretations have been attached to this case, none of them established. The first, and the one favoured by abduction researchers, is that Christina herself was taken that night alongside her son, that the object in her leg was inserted during that period, and that the missing time explains her inability to recall going to bed. Supporters of this theory point to a pattern reported in other cases in which one occupant of a room remains fully conscious while others present sleep through the entire event and cannot be awoken. The second interpretation focuses on the craft itself. Large, black, silent triangles have been reported across the United States for decades, and a substantial body of opinion holds that at least some of them are terrestrial in origin, most often identified with a rumoured aircraft designated the TR-3B. If that is correct, the proximity of Fort Hood becomes relevant in a different way, and the incident becomes a question of military activity rather than extraterrestrial contact. Both readings are speculative. Neither is supported by physical evidence, and no corroborating witness to the Killeen sighting has ever come forward. A second abduction claim was reported from Texas in the same month. It concerns the town of Vidor. Just before midnight on the 11th of October 1994, and was also submitted to a reporting platform in 2007. The witness, a young boy at the time, stated that he was walking home when a sudden bright light appeared without warning. He described it as hitting him and causing him to freeze in place. The next thing he was aware of was running down the street as fast as he could, gripped by a terror he could not account for. As he ran, he realised he was considerably further from home than he had been when the light appeared, as though he had been returned to an earlier point on his route. He believed the event took place directly in front of his own house. When he did reach home, his mother was distressed and told him he was 2 hours late. It was shortly after 1 a.m. He went to bed confused and said nothing about it to anyone. Later, while showering, he found 3 small dots arranged in a triangle under his arm. In the period that followed, he began to experience recurring nightmares in which he was lying in a bright, cold room surrounded by figures of 2 distinct builds, one tall and one petite. It is not known whether the Vidor incident was isolated or part of a longer sequence of experiences. The wider Texas record for the autumn and early winter of 1994 contains several additional sightings. On the afternoon of the 10th of October at around 3 p.m. in Mercedes, a witness reported watching an F-16 fighter jet pursue an anomalous craft for several minutes. Amateur footage of the pursuit was broadcast once by a local news station and has not surfaced since. The following day in San Antonio, a little after 7 a.m., a witness reported a grey ball in the sky overhead, described as perfectly round with a thick band across the middle resembling a belt. It was visible for approximately 30 seconds. 4 days later, on the 15th of October, a college student in the Marshall region reported an orange fiery disc hovering just above the tree line at around 11 p.m. He estimated it to be larger than a car, and it crossed the sky at a very high speed. It produced a rushing sound, which he noted was not consistent with conventional aircraft. On the 25th of October, at around 1:30 a.m, a witness in the San Antonio area near Randolph Air Force Base reported an amorphous floating shape overhead, which they compared to an ink spot. It was silent, and the sighting lasted around a minute. In the minutes after it disappeared, an unusual wind moved through the area. The sightings continued into the following year. At around 10 p.m, one night in January 1995, in the Claiborne region of Texas, a witness and 2 friends were driving home from an ice hockey game when all 3 noticed an object in the sky above them. The road was quiet and the area undisturbed, so they pulled over and got out of the car. The object had a black exterior, and its triangular shape was difficult to distinguish against the night sky, but all 3 could clearly see 3 bright lights arranged in a triangular pattern. Their first assumption was that it was a surveillance aircraft operating out of the local military base. They dismissed that when they realised it was not travelling across the sky, but holding position. Despite being barely 500 feet from the ground, it produced no sound whatsoever. The 3 of them watched it hover, and then it accelerated into the distance at extreme speed, still in complete silence. Had they not happened to be looking upward, none of them would have had any indication that anything was overhead. A case recorded over a decade earlier and on the other side of the Atlantic contains a series of closely matching details. It took place in Cleveland, in the north of England, in the summer of 1982, and was documented by Carl Negatis and Philip Mantle in their book Without Consent. The witnesses are identified in that account by the pseudonyms George and Amanda. At around 1 a.m. on the 30th of August, the couple switched off their television and went upstairs to bed. Shortly afterwards, a piercing scream came from the bedroom of their baby daughter, Sarah. Both parents went straight to the room, recognising from the intensity of the scream that something was seriously wrong. George reached into the cot and lifted Sarah out, passing her to Amanda, who checked her for injuries and found none. While they were trying to work out what had caused her to cry out, they noticed a bright light illuminating the room from the direction of the garden. George looked out of the window and saw an oval-shaped object at the far end of the garden with a figure standing beside it. He called Amanda over to the window to look. While she was still looking out, George left the room and stepped onto the landing. There he saw two further figures. They were climbing the stairs towards him. At that point, his memory ended. George's next recollection was of walking into the kitchen the following morning and telling Amanda that he had had a strange dream. He had no memory of the remainder of the night and none of waking up. When Amanda replied that she had also had an unusual dream and began describing it, the two of them realised they were describing the same events and that these were unlikely to have been dreams. An examination of Sarah's room produced nothing further. Amanda did independently recall stepping onto the landing shortly after her husband and finding no sign of him. The couple ultimately agreed to undergo hypnotic regression. Under hypnosis, Amanda recalled substantially more than George, whose memory of the period remained blocked. She described calling out her husband's name several times with no response, then hearing a noise from the stairs. Looking down, she saw a small figure with pale, unusual skin and a long face that appeared to have neither nose nor ears. It stayed in one position, watching her, with a second figure standing a short distance behind it. She then began moving down the stairs, though not by her own decision, and her next awareness was of being outside. She could not identify where. She was alone. Sarah was no longer in her arms, and she described feeling frightened. Her next memory was of waking in her own bed. Several months after the encounter, George became seriously ill and spent around 3 months in hospital. Doctors determined that he had developed a disease in which his own immune system was attacking his blood cells. He recovered following a course of steroids. Whether the illness is connected to the events of that August night is unestablished, though a number of people reporting close encounters have gone on to develop health problems in the following weeks and months. Cases involving very young children raise a specific evidential problem, and the case of Jason Andrews illustrates both sides of it. As a teenager, Jason told his parents that beings had been visiting him at night since he was a small child, and that he had been taken from his bed into a room where they carried out procedures on him. He dated the beginning of these experiences to his 4th birthday. On that day, according to his parents, a bright and sunny afternoon was interrupted by a sudden and violent thunderstorm. Jason began reciting numbers in a flat, unresponsive tone. When investigators later examined those sequences, they were found to correspond to highly complex equations. He then told his parents plainly that they were waiting for him and that he had to go, and his parents had to physically prevent him from walking out of the house into the storm. When the storm ended, he returned to normal. The incident was set aside and not revisited until his disclosure almost 10 years later. The difficulty is that children have been demonstrated in controlled studies to be capable of generating false memories, particularly around unusual subject matter, which is why the accounts given by adults in the Colleen and Cleveland cases carry different weight. None of these cases is supported by physical proof. In Killeen, there were no external witnesses, no photographs, and no medical examination of the object Christina reported beneath her skin. The report was filed roughly 13 years after the fact. The Vidor account was submitted in the same year and rests entirely on the recollection of a witness describing something that happened to him as a child. The George and Amanda case depends in large part on hypnotic regression, a method whose reliability is disputed within psychology. Skeptics have pointed out that advanced military aircraft, sleep-related phenomena, and misinterpretation of lights at night can account for much of what is described, and that the presence of a large military installation beside Killeen makes conventional explanations more available rather than less. The weight of these accounts lies not in any single one of them, but in the specific details they hold in common. In each case, the memory loss is total but temporary, returning in fragments hours or years afterwards rather than being lost outright. In each case, an infant is the first indication that something is wrong by crying or going missing from a crib. In each case, the object outside is close, low, and completely silent, and in Killeen and Claiborne, it is the same black triangle. In each case, one adult in the house is unreachable, either asleep and impossible to wake, or physically absent with no memory of where they went. Christina, the Vidor witness, and the Claiborne trio all describe physical marks or effects afterwards. 3 dots beneath an arm, an object under the skin, a serious illness months later. Christina waited 13 years before telling anyone outside her own family and had no access to the Cleveland account or to the report filed from Vidor in the same year. What corresponds between them are details a fabricator would have the least reason to invent and least reason to expect anyone else to report independently. Christina has never confirmed her identity, has never sought publicity, and has stated that the night in October 1994 was one of many experiences she has not described.